The Strength Beyond Struggle podcast brings you mental health stories from the front lines. We're sponsored by Ending the Silence, a program by the National Alliance for Mental Illness, NAMI, funded by the Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System. We bring you the stories of people with lived experience. We do not offer therapy for any mental health condition and cannot substitute for professional assessment and treatment. In every episode, we deal with difficult mental health topics, including suicide. So if you're struggling, remember, you can always get help by calling 988. Hey, welcome. Today I have Sierra Grande. Since the age of 11, she's now 29, Sierra has struggled to figure out why she feels, thinks, and acts in ways that hurt. Her thoughts have taken her in some really dark places, like psychiatric hospitals, residential treatment centers, Misdiagnosis, and countless medical appointments. It's kind of exhausting. But she's come out of that to create a life through telling her story of managing her disabilities, including living with ADHD and autism. Thank you, Sierra, for being with us today to explain how telling your story contributes to healing. So if you could start with us back and go back to 11 when things really started. As 11 years old, everybody, 11 years old.
Thank you, Michelle. So we're going to start with my mental health story. It's mental health disability. It's just mine. When I was 11, I called the police on myself. It was a mental health crisis because I did not want to be around anymore. I was hurting. I was sad. And it was just very hard. And I grew up in a really rural Minnesota town. And in that time period, I had been taught that if your life was in danger, you call 911. And now you would call 988, but that wasn't available back then. And so I called the police on myself. It was a summer day. My older brother was there. My parents were at work. Everything kind of just was collapsed in on itself. And a police officer came and assessed the situation. They determined I was, in fact, a threat to myself. So I was put in an ambulance, and then I was shuttled off to the nearest emergency room. And I was there for, in my memory, quite a while until they found a bed for somebody as young as me. So then I was put in another ambulance and then shuttled off over 200 miles away to my first 72-hour-old. And
I'm terrifying. You're 11 years old. That's very young. And your parents, were they with you, or your mother, or anyone?
Not that I remember. Not in the, like they were at the emergency room. They came and met there, but I don't think that I know they were not in the ambulance, and they weren't there to like check me in or anything. They were doing the best they could with the information they had. They were blindsided by this, truly. I mean, I was always a lot as a child. I was sad, but I was also anxious and picky. I was quirky. Yeah, I was doing my best. I just experienced life in a different way. Around 11, that's just things were too much, and I didn't want to necessarily die, but I did want to go to sleep forever, if that makes sense. Like, it wasn't that I had this understanding of like a difference between those.
You're 11 and you're trying to grab this concept of death, and you probably just wanted the pain to stop, because my daughter also had suicidal behavior, and she said you just want the pain to stop. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't understand suicide and suicide ideation. So thank you for explaining to us that it hurts. And that's why I said that your thoughts hurt you. And so, after 11, how did the journey go?
I was put on, that was when I was diagnosed with the generalized anxiety disorder and depression, and put on some medication, and then went home. They tried to do a partial treatment program, and I was there for a little while, but insurance issues cut us off, so we were unable to continue that. And so it was therapy for a while. I went back to school. That was during summer, the first hospitalization, but then I went back to school, and school was rough. And so this is like middle school. I got bullied. I was bigger than everyone. It was just a really tough experience. I was always weird, but not really understanding why I was weird. And so I started switching schools. I was trying my best to not have these anxiety and depression thoughts continue to happen. And they did. By 13, I did attempt to take my life. And then I was
13.
hospitalized again. And then I was put on different medication. And then I had different therapy. And then I was hospitalized again. So by 14, the county got involved because my parents didn't have like money, and they were trying to, we had insurance through my dad, thankfully, but they didn't know what was really going on. They were doing the best they could in the system. And so they worked with the county, and the county placed me in a residential treatment center when I was 14. This was either 8th grade or 9th grade.
You know, see the scary people in the psychiatric ward. Is that like what you're talking about?
In the in the like 72-hour holds in the hospitals, yes. It wasn't terrible. It depended on the hospital because I went to almost every adolescent hospital in Minnesota I went to, as far as I know. But by 14, okay, the residential treatment center was it was a Catholic Charities program. And it was, they called all these things cabins. So they had a bunch of different cabins, some for girls only, boys only, mixed. I was in one of the mixed cabins. And it was bizarre. It was just, I felt like this is not like appropriate language to use now, but like the 14-year-old angsty version of me felt like I was the craziest of the sane people and the most sane of the crazy people. And so I kept feeling like I wasn't getting help because, especially in a place like a residential treatment center, where I am a rule follower, I am doing everything I can in order not to be seen as inconvenient. I was the perfect like person for patient client for these. I would be helpful, I'd clean, I'd do what I needed to, but at the same time, I would also be shamed for being a bit like manipulative because I wanted out. I didn't want to stay there longer than 3 months. And so I did end up getting a borderline personality disorder diagnosis around this time because I had distress, like my emotions were too big. I didn't really know how to communicate well. Social situations, I was misreading them. And it was really hard. And I mean, I'm not a fan of any teenager getting diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. I make jokes now about how like every teenager has a little bit of a personality disorder. That's kind of what puberty is. Like, don't
Yes.
But so I got out, and then I tried a couple different schools, and I finally landed on a school that had a 4-day week, very rural school. Like, my understanding has always been that it was a 4-day week because the Mondays were used to farm. Like some of my classmates would be working that day. I graduated with 32 kids in my graduating class, but I don't remember graduating because I ended up having another depressive episode. And I, again, did not want to be living anymore. This time, though, because I had tried everything else, and I was 18, very important here. It was senior year. I was 18. The doctors, and I must have consented, because that's how this works, did electroconvulsive therapy, which is modern day shock therapy. ECT is the shortened acronym for this. And so ECT, if you don't know what that is, it induces a small seizure in your brain, and the thought process is that it kind of shakes up the neural network in order to create some better connections, so you're not so stuck in the ruminations and the ideations. They did bilateral the first times around. They were doing it every 3 days a week, my understanding. And the bilateral caused amnesia. I cannot remember. And I can't remember graduating. I can't remember my senior year of high school. I can't remember the first college I went to. And so I did stuff. I lived that, but I don't remember it. And so I did go to college. I question all of the adults in my life who let me just go do that and take out the student loans and go to Wisconsin for theater. But I did that. I withdrew without getting any credits, and I went and I lived with my parents for a little while. That wasn't working as a 19-year-old because I was angsty. I was depressed. I wasn't, I didn't have much control over my feelings. And it was just really difficult. And I was also very high energy, like very ambitious, but then I burn out. It was rough. And so I did get a diagnosis of bipolar type 2 around this time. What they were perceiving as hypomanic was what I now know is like intense hyperfocus. And so that was what it was. I did continue in the cycle of mental health stuff though. And along all of this, I also was developing chronic pain disorders. So at 13, I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome, fibromyalgia. Later on, I then find out about endometriosis. And then even later on, I find out about a polycystic kidney disorder. And so I'm living with chronic invisible pain on top of mental health disorders that I have been told many, many times not to talk about because that's going to lead to bullying. But at the other side of that, I was also like incentivized to talk about it regularly because that was what my safety plan was. So I got these like mixed messages all the time. Anyway, so like
Crazy man.
and then oh for sure. And then yeah, with the misdiagnoses and I was just trying my best. I was doing everything I could to just survive.
Misdiagnoses are something that a lot of people deal with in the mental health world. It's sometimes difficult to get dial in the correct. Were you and then were you treated for these misdiagnoses, and did that hurt you or harm you or put you at risk in any way?
Yes and no. I mean, they were trying their best. Like I went through DBT a couple times because of the borderline personality disorder diagnosis. And I actually find a lot of those tools helpful, and I use a lot of those still because I think that in general, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, is a really important tool that could be taught to teenagers in general. Like it would be very helpful for more people to know those skills. And so that was helpful. And so getting different types of skills and tools from different things. I see diagnoses in the medical model of disability to be maps. So whatever DSM criteria you fit, that is a map. And then they'll give you the map because other people have walked that journey, and then they know what has worked and what hasn't worked for people with that map. So what you're doing is you're giving me the wrong map, and I'm trying to walk that map and go through those treatments. Sometimes that might be really helpful on accident, and other times I might end up in obstacles because I don't see them on the map. That's how I think about it.
And so that's a healthy way to look at it.
Thank you. To like spoiler alert, it took me until about 2 or 3 years ago to find out that it's actually ADHD and autism this entire time. So all of that, but that's okay. In 2013, which is the same year that I was undergoing electroconvulsive therapy for the first time, that's when the DSM changed. And so I would not have been able to be diagnosed with autism and ADHD prior to that. So the time I got diagnosed with borderline, there would have been no possible way of me getting the diagnosis. It would have either been ADHD or it would have been Asperger's. That's likely what it would have been if they caught it. But then that gets us into DSM just talking about women.
That is a whole other subject. So it happens. You use the acronym DSM.
Or diagnostic statistic manual. I think it's the manual with all of the how we all get diagnosed. It's the medical model diagnostic book to keep just a bunch of patterns of symptoms that we have decided to pathologize. And then if people have that pattern and meet all of the criteria in the DSM, that is what then gets diagnosed. So with that, there was a change from DSM-4 to DSM-5 in 2013.
And so are you saying that, and I want the audience to understand that, I mean, part of why we're telling stories here on this podcast is for people to understand that your story is kind of unfortunately typical, and the
Yes.
complicated, yes, the things that you've gone through, and the misdiagnosis, and the this and the treatment and that treatment and this hospital, this is not, so what in NAMI that we do, and we're going to get to NAMI in a minute, the
Oh
National
yeah.
Alliance on Mental Illness. But part of the reason we do this stuff is that we're trying to help other people not to go through a situation you did.
Exactly.
And
And it's
so it's a journey. And I
that's what
want to
we say
get you,
often in NAMI. Yeah.
you were saying, so with you now, like, I think we're up to high school now, or are
We're
we out of high
past
school? You
we're
graduated?
in the we've passed the first college I went to. I went back home for a year and then I moved because that just wasn't going to work. So I moved into a like half studio apartment because I just financially couldn't afford anything else. So like there was a shared bathroom with other people. It was, but I had my little corner. Um, and there I went to a tech college for a little while. I was like, maybe I'll be a paralegal. Didn't really like my professor. And so I withdrew. I had this really bad habit of, because I was yelling perfectionism. And I would withdraw out of classes if I determined that there was any chance I'd get an A minus or less. It was really, it is what it is. Honestly, I'm younger version of me. I've learned a lot. And also I'm kind of grateful for that version because if I hadn't done that, I don't know what my GPA would have been. And I did end up having a really great GPA. I did get into law school because top 20 law school because of it. So like, I don't recommend doing that, especially since I was like, I was like, I'm going to be a paralegal. And I didn't like the professor, like, or the way she was teaching. And so then I was like, if I ever actually go into the legal field, I'm going to be a lawyer anyway. But like, that didn't cross my mind to be even an actual thing. That was just me being petty. It was a menace. I love that version of me. I really do. I hold her dear, but she like there was a lot going on with that girl.
Yeah, I love how, like
That
you
was
said, and the thing we learn with NAMI is kind of compartmentalizing, sort of forgiving what you did. And since I mentioned NAMI a bit, and I think people understand, you got through so when did you find NAMI in all of this?
NAMI was a couple years later. So I ended up going to a tech college and then transferring to a state college. And I was going to finish my marketing degree there. And then I went through a whole thing with my colon almost having to be taken out. So I withdrew out of school. I was like, I'm disabled. I can't do anything, which at that point in my life was a very true statement. And so it took me a while and I went through another mental health crisis in 2018. And throughout this on and off, I was going through ECT as well, just unilateral. So my memory was affected, but not nearly as bad as it was when I was in high school. And so then I got into recovery in April 2019 with ketamine infusions. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to go back to school. And I started going back to school for a psychology degree with a economics minor. And then I was like, what am I going to do after school? Didn't want to take the GRE. So I was like, I will take the LSAT and I'll go to law school because I like school and I wanted to understand how the mental health system works. And in order to understand how the mental health system works, I had to understand how statutes work. So like, I'll do law school. How in the world am I going to convince a law school that I am not a huge risk, that I am not, because of my entire, like 4 different undergrads plus a bunch of hospitalizations? How? And that's where I selfishly got involved with NAMI. I was like, well, if I can convince this organization that I am in recovery, then maybe that will convince law school. And then I applied to be a facilitator, and they're like, well, you need to go to groups first. And I was like, okay. Started going to groups. I fell in love with NAMI, like NAMI support groups, fell in love. So then I started getting involved a little bit, and then COVID hit. So I started to facilitate. I was one of the youngest of the facilitators, and so I was pretty okay with technology. So I started to facilitate groups online twice a week during COVID because there was a need. There was a huge need. Around this time also, there was a call for young voices in the In Our Own Voice program. And in our own voice is where you share your recovery story. You tell people what happened, very similar to what I just did with you. And then you talk about what helps and then what's next. And I was drawn to that because they were like, we need people. And I was like, I need something to do in law school. And then I was trained on how to put my story together, which was the first time. And
Your life.
100%. And I was a theater kid. I've always loved talking. It's easier. It's easier to just be able to like connect with an audience or with a purpose, and the story, like the highlights and the lessons of my story was the purpose. And I found that it had value rather than just trauma. And that was really, really powerful. And then I continued to connect with more and more peers who were also sharing their stories. And that made me value not only my story, but my lived experience as an authority and a place of worthy of sharing from a place of expertise. Like my story and my experience is worthy, and everyone's is.
So what you're saying is that it sounds like as you were telling your story earlier, it was such a burden to have this mental health condition. And then you throw in the physical conditions, and that's another burden. And it's just a block to getting you your dreams. And then boom, 180, you tell the story of all the struggles you're going through and all these difficulties. And wow, it opens up. And now you're actually consulting with corporations and telling them about folks like you and how to work with them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really lucky. And also there's like, it's bittersweet, right? Because I now have full control over my story, which also means I tend to intellectualize it a little bit. So I'm a bit distanced from it because I've told it so many times, and I am really grateful for it. I'm glad that I even had the opportunity to share it. On the flip side, there's also this part where I'm able to create this hero's journey, because that's what people want to hear. They want to hear like, oh, there was like this hurt and then an accomplishment. But the way that I tell the story, especially during In Our Own Voice, is that in the beginning, my first draft of it, it always would end, like what happened would always end April 2019. That's when I got into recovery. I started ketamine. I started doing some different lifestyle changes. I started getting involved in a variety of different treatments, and I found my path into recovery. And I got very lucky, and I was very supported in that. And then as I continued doing In Our Own Voices, which I've done, I don't even know how many I've done, but I've done many at this point. I've been doing this for 4 years now. I can see the progression of how my story has evolved, because for a while it was just like 2019. And then I got into law school. And then I started my first full-time job in my first summer, and I developed an eating disorder. And it was binge eating disorder. So I didn't take that seriously, which is a bit frustrating coming from like, I've been a mental health advocate this entire time, but eating disorders tend to be most under talked about as mental health disorders in my experience. And they're so important to be talking about because they're so comorbid. Like it's just the likelihood of having both, especially in women, and then not being able to really recognize, is this just how women are, or is this a disorder, is really hard. And
well, and what you said right there, I think it's important for the audience to understand you're chugging along, you're doing great within our own voice, and then bam, you come with another crisis. So this journey, just when you find something even as powerful as In Our Own Voice, it doesn't matter. Life will throw you some sort of curveball, and you'll go in another crisis. And that's kind of what NAMI teaches you too.
Well, recovery is a journey and not a destination. And I hold that 100%. Like even throughout all of this, I still considered myself in mental health recovery, because it didn't get to a point of life-threatening mental health disorder. And that's where my line is for recovery, is as long as it is not life-threatening for me and I have the tools to get through it, it's merely another obstacle. I can be in recovery and also be at a point where there's a temporary obstacle. And that's how I was thinking of it. And so it's an obstacle. I have the tools. I go to my psychiatrist. I talk to him about it. And he was like, okay, let's get you an eating disorder therapist. Let's do this. So we try to do that, but then there's a shortage. So we're kind of like that wasn't working. So I go again, like the next month. I'm like, I'm still struggling. He's, how about we try a medication? There's one medication that helps with binge eating disorder. And I was like, yeah, let's try it. I don't really have anything to lose right now. I try it. It's a stimulant, and things shift in a way that I do not have good language for. I have better control on my food, but more importantly, I have better control on my stress during the day. And so we circled back on that, and he was like, oh, you need to get an evaluation. We need to, because this medication also treated ADHD. And then we were looking back historically, because ADHD is something you're born with. And so you like when getting diagnosed, you have to look like, has this been present throughout everything? It was like, oh, hypomania? No. Hyperfocus. Not being able to like being impulsive through borderline personality disorder, ADHD. Quirky little girl who's very loud and rambunctious and theatrical, ADHD. And then on the flip side of that, when I went and got the neuro evaluation, which in and of itself was very difficult to get. Like, it's an expensive process. I had to call several different people. There's just, that was a very, very frustrating experience, especially since it's like, oh, I've been mental health advocate and I've been in this field and I'm a law student and I'm like having trouble navigating the system. And so the entire time I'm dealing with a bit of like survivor's guilt, being like, if I have survived what I've survived and I still am having difficulty trying to navigate this, those who have not been able to get to the point of recovery trying to get this, there's so many roadblocks that it'd be like, I'm not even going to try. Like, what is the point? So I'm just really grateful for what I have been able to get to, but there are a lot of barriers. I was able to go and have a full day evaluation, and there I was diagnosed with, well, maybe I was re-diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, treatment-resistant depression in remission, which is probably my biggest accomplishment ever. I think that like having my, and then ADHD and autism. And that made sense to me. I had been suspecting both of those for, well, the autism I had been suspecting for a little while, especially since the beginning of law school, where I was like, oh, I'm odd, but I'm odd in a way that isn't just like normal odd. There's something here that just doesn't work. And I had been getting involved in the neurodiversity movement. And that's something that really kind of like goes hand in hand, because a lot of the neurodiversity movement stems from a lot of autism movements.
So I just want to ask you real quick about autism. I assume autism is, and most of the kids I've seen or people I've seen with autism, there seems to be a inability to relate to social cues, and there's an inability to, right now you're looking in the camera and you're watching, and it doesn't seem like the people I assume that have autism. So I am naive. I haven't met a lot of people with autism. So explain to me yours, and how yours works.
So in 2013, when the DSM was changed, it created autism into a spectrum disorder. So autism, as we know, like little boys who like trains and like don't talk much, like that version of autism was put in. But then so was Asperger's and another one or two that I cannot remember off the top of my head. And they were all blended into the spectrum. And the spectrum isn't like more or less autism. There are levels. So there's level 1, 2, and 3 of autism. Level 3 is version with the highest support needs, the lowest functioning. And I have incredibly mixed feelings about the term functioning, because you have to define what you mean by functioning. And level 1 is the version that needs the least amount of supports, and also typically is the highest masking. And masking is important to talk about here, because I think that when we're talking about autism and what it looks like, those who are high masking are very good at trying to be seen as normal at the detriment to themselves. Like they're kind of hurting themselves in order to be seen as appropriate. Because my fear, even now, I work very hard on this, but even now, my biggest fear is to be seen as inconvenient. I don't want to be seen as a burden. And I know that I have a lot of blind spots. I know that there are a lot of things I don't know, and that's okay. For me, eye contact is I'm good at faking it because I was in theater so much. And that's also why there's such a musicality in my voice. Like I was trained into this. I also, but if you dive a little bit more into it, I have the ADHD side of things as well. So trying to split those two up is like hard. So blending them together, you kind of get this like more hyperactive, like flighty version of me with a version of me that has a tax law master's degree for just because it was free, just for free. Like, or I make everything into quests. I have like the everything on this board right here is just me. Like I write myself a little note and it's like a pinned quest. Everything is a game in my brain, so I filter everything through like like a Skyrim or a Dungeons and Dragons thing, which we'll talk about in a different episode. But all of that is just the way that my brain works, and it's pretty neutral. I love my brain, and I also hate my brain. It's a very love-hate relationship. I mean, I know that it's life-threatening. Like I have a ton of disorders, right? A lot of different diagnoses. There's chronic pain, but the life-threatening disorder I've had was depression, was my brain. And so that's always something that I try to keep in mind is like I've been very successful academically, but also there's a lot going on.
And that's why your story is so beautiful, because I think a lot of, as I do NAMI classes and and I hear the stories of people and what they're struggling with, it's just this overwhelm of, I just want this over. I just want to feel normal. And I think your story is an example of it's okay. You can find balance other ways. And is that
Yeah,
kind of the advice you give?
yeah. Trying to actively find normal ends up making you feel smaller, and then like it's tight, like it's a tight, heavy feeling. And long ago, I gave up on that, mostly because it just wasn't serving me in the slightest. And so being like, I'm a big, like I'm tall, I'm loud, I'm a big person. But in this world, women especially, but just in general, incentivized to be smaller and like take up less space, take up less resources. And after a while, that just kind of cuts at your soul. And I've given up on it. I don't subscribe to that. There is abundance in this world, and I'm painfully an optimist now to a point where sometimes that gets me in trouble. I also do have like a law degree, so like I do understand the nuance in the world a little bit. Like I get that. Like I can digest what the Supreme Court is doing, for example. Not my favorite skill to have, and rather I can still stay like an optimist because I can choose my own stories. That's where it is. Like I get to choose.
And
I get to have.
is that the is that the
I think
advice you
so
give people?
to a certain extent because I think that stories are so powerful, and the placebo effect is also incredibly powerful. That's why we have to do double-blind studies. And so, with that power, to be a cliche, but with that power comes responsibility. And so we are given so much information all the time, and a lot of it's sad or is meant to enrage us to get our attention, or is to make us feel bad in order to sell us something. And if we take that information and then blend it into our story, it can become really dangerous. And so I don't think that it's just as simple as create your story, hold your story, and then like make put it out there, because it's not as simple as that. And that also leads to an issue where people with disabilities could be seen as inspiration porn, which is the actual term that is used in the community, which is putting people up on a pedestal and not looking at the nuance of the disability. And so it's like, oh, look at this person who was able to do this thing despite being disabled. And that can be a challenge because it comes from a place of ableism. So it's like, oh, they can't do that normally.
I just find your story inspirational because number one, you got grit, you don't give up. Number two, you lost the shame and the fear around what's going on with you. And number three, that you are taking this now and you've, like I said, you've created a consulting group for corporations to help. And you also have, I'm not sure how to describe it, but you take people on this journey of the gaming. And we are going to talk that in a podcast, but finding these tools and creating these things, and they're your own. They're yours. I've never seen anyone do quite what you're doing, but you figured it out.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of people who, I think it's the toolkit. And I've been well, I've had to be able to use these tools or I wouldn't be able to be a productive member of society. And that's what people tend to appreciate rather than comfort or things. But you use the word shame, and I want to highlight that because that's really important. I still feel shame. We all end up doing it. It's unfortunately a part of people. It's a feeling. But with shame, there is a privilege to be able to fight it. And I knew that I'd end up mentioning Brene Brown somewhere. Here it is. But with to combat shame, you have to have vulnerability. And oftentimes, in order to be vulnerable, you have to have the safety to be vulnerable. And I think that for me, that there's often a lot of privilege there. And I want to just recognize that because many people in the same set of circumstances wouldn't be able to get where I am because they aren't able to be vulnerable to get the help they need. And I just want to highlight that. So oftentimes people are still sitting in shame, sitting in the stigma. Sometimes it makes sense. And that's why I do a lot of work in workplaces around neurodiversity, which is just an umbrella term about the diversity of brains. And then neurodivergent ends up being brains that are pathologized. Oftentimes, if you look at that term narrowly, it's neurodevelopmental disorders, ADHD, autism, dyscalculia, dyslexia. But if you look at it broadly, which I prefer to do, it includes mental health disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, any brains that work differently based on the systems like we have and then are pathologized. Neurodivergent. It's estimated that about 25% of people could, in theory, identify as neurodivergent. Though neurodivergent, neurotypical, neurodiversity, all of that, it is a social movement. So none of this is a medical diagnosis. If you're neurodivergent, that's not a medical term. But using that and using the tools of that movement helps for me in my work. It ends up helping companies have a better understanding that there are certain limitations of some people's brains where they can't do things as easily as others can, and they're compensating for it, and that might lead to burnout. And if we can accommodate and help everyone, let's make I mean self-accommodations, not legal accommodations. And this, obviously legal accommodations, ADA, for example, that's the floor. That's a legal right for people with disabilities. But I'm talking in general, the more you accommodate, the more accessible the system is.
So let's take an example. If you're having a mental health crisis, let's say your depression kicks up. Now I have a daughter who's got bipolar and ADHD, and she does go through depressive episodes. And so for her to be able to say, hey, I'm going through a depressive episode, I need a week off to deal with this. And for the corporation to understand that and say, we know that you're going to take this time off, and when you come back, you'll be more. This is what you're kind of suggesting to corporations and maybe even schools and systems, and saying that we need to be a little more flexible.
Yeah.
And that's what you're asking.
So on one part of that, we have the legal part of it, and I'm actually just going to throw that to the side because I'm not doing legal advice right now. But the social movement aspect of that is absolutely, if you have somebody that is a good worker, there is an incentive to try to help them out. That's what's going to retain people. It is expensive to have that turnover. And understanding that so many more people are living with some form of mental health disorder or condition than companies really realize is important to recognize. And I think I know that this is becoming more and more known in companies. This is talked about all the time right now, or I'm incredibly biased because I'm the one leading some of these conversations. But so I do recognize that there is that issue happening, but it is getting better to a certain extent. There's this division in this country right now that is difficult to navigate because some people believe that trying to accommodate others or have a tolerance for other people's distress. My perspective is do it so that it's the right thing to do, trying to help others so that they aren't always in distress. Some people hold the perspective that that's just being woke, or that's just being like people are being too sensitive and they're just trying to accommodate people's sensitivity. Yeah, it's shaming. Some people will shame because they were shamed. And
yes, and so that's a hard thing to get through, and that's why we're having this conversation today.
100%.
And I am so that you are a consultant having this conversation with corporations because I know my daughter's struggling. She's 24 and she's just starting, working in the world. And I'm frustrated that the corporations won't recognize her brilliance, but her needs. There's a balance there. And thank you so much for being with us here. And we're going to come back with you and talk about something else. But this one, you have told us a story of, if there's a parent out there, just listen to this one and hear that your kid just might need a lot of support, and they'll come through it though, because you are amazing. And I met you in June, and I'm astonished with what you've done, and you make such an impression. And I thank you for helping our audience to understand some really tricky issues.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sierra talked about the healing power of telling her own story. I couldn't agree more. That's why we call our podcast Strength Beyond Struggle. Every day, we see the impact of the stories of our NAMI Ending the Silence Youth presenters. But did you know that psychiatrists have also documented the power of storytelling? It's even got a name, narrative therapy. This is a tool used to treat depression, anxiety, drug addiction, and even bipolar disorder. The treatment involves a therapist who helps the patient tell their story. Now, it might not make sense to have a therapist help you tell your story because it's yours, but people say this helps give context and meaning to how things happened, and it gives them control over their own stories. It really works, according to a growing number of studies of narrative therapy. For instance, it helps adults with mood disorders, according to a review of 18 studies published in the journal SSM Mental Health. Teaching people to tell their stories can provide a low-cost, effective addition to conventional therapies, researchers concluded. That includes depression and anxiety. The storytelling approach could also help people with bipolar disorder. But the evidence is less strong. Some 21% of adults in the U.S. will suffer major depressive disorder during their lifetimes. Narrative therapy can also offer additional benefits to people in groups that face social stigma. That includes refugees, victims of violent relationships, minority groups, and victims of war and trauma. It turns out that shaping your experience into a story can help reject the prejudices other people impose on your experience. Chris Coulter in the online journal Medium cited a study showing that just listening to someone else's story can reduce anxiety and stress. So how's it going listening to our stories? Another study found these stories can also increase empathy and understanding. So these stories can reduce the stigma that makes mental health challenges so much harder. Another study looked at the use of storytelling in group therapy for people recovering from meth addiction. That study found storytelling significantly reduced depression and anxiety. However, it didn't improve their overall quality of life when compared to a control group. Of course, telling our stories has its risks. Sometimes telling the story causes flashbacks. Sometimes it dredges up traumatic memories. And sometimes the listeners react with judgment. That's one reason we don't have open comments online on our podcast. People can say the most painful things when sitting behind a screen. And that's why we must respect the courage of the storyteller. We believe in the power of story, including those you will get on our website. You can also find links there to the research we've been talking about. So thank you for watching Strength Beyond Struggle and listening to our stories.
It's okay to just be me. We're all made to be unique. It's okay to have my needs. It's okay to be me. What's easy for others are struggles for me. I do things differently. Doesn't make me broken, it just makes me me. People out there help me through, ones who care about me and you. Through my struggles I find my strength. Feels so good to be me. What's easy for others are struggles for me. I do things differently. Doesn't make me broken, it just makes me me. People helping me to get through have their own struggles too. Even though they have their strength, they are human like me. Through these struggles we build our strength. We all want to feel healthy. Even though we make mistakes, struggles build our strength.